Let me tell you about Ambassador Krelnuth, because honestly, this guy was a piece of work. Picture a garden slug that somehow convinced itself it was destined for greatness, grew to about 4 feet tall, and developed an ego the size of a small moon. That's Krelnuth in a nutshell, or should I say in a shell, because this slimy little bureaucrat literally left a trail wherever he went. Now Krelnuth had made quite the name for himself in the Galactic Council by specializing in what he called delicate negotiations with primitive species, which, translated from pretentious alien speak, meant he was really good at bullying civilizations that couldn't fight back. His success rate was impressive, mainly because most species took one look at his bodyguard and decided that whatever trade agreement he was pushing probably wasn't worth arguing about. Speaking of his bodyguard, meet Vextard. If nightmares could mate with a blender and somehow produce offspring, Vextar would be their pride and joy. This thing stood 12 feet tall on legs that could crush a small vehicle, had arms ending in claws that could open a can or a ribcage with equal ease, and a mouth full of teeth that would make a shark weep with envy. Oh, and it could spit acid, because apparently the universe has a twisted sense of humor when it comes to evolutionary advantages. Vextar hailed from a charming little death trap called Mortis Prime, where the local wildlife considered genocide a recreational activity. The planet's tourism board, if it had one, would probably use the slogan "Visit Mortis Prime, you won't live to regret it." Everything on that rock was designed to kill everything else, and Vextar had clawed its way to the top of that particular food chain through a combination of ruthless efficiency and what could generously be called extreme violence. The Galactic Council had recruited Vextar after it single-handedly ended a civil war by eating both sides' leadership during a peace negotiation. They figured anyone crazy enough to hire this walking nightmare as security probably wasn't worth fighting with. It was diplomacy through intimidation, and it worked beautifully. So naturally, when the Council received reports about some upstart species called humans causing a fuss in Sector 7, they sent their dream team. Krelnuth would handle the talking, Vextar would handle the implied threats of horrible death, and everyone would go home happy. Well, everyone except the humans, but who cared about them? The briefing on humans was hilariously thin. Apparently, they were some kind of barely evolved primate that had somehow stumbled into space travel. They were so pathetically adapted to their own environment that they needed to wear artificial coverings just to survive their planet's weather. They had no natural weapons, no protective armor, and their bite force was laughably weak. The intelligence report actually used the phrase "harmless by galactic standards," which should have been everyone's first clue that someone hadn't done their homework. Krelnuth was practically vibrating with excitement as their ship approached Earth. This was going to be his easiest assignment yet. A few threats, maybe let Vextar flex a little, and these humans would be signing whatever trade agreement he put in front of them. He was already planning his victory speech to the Council about how he'd single-handedly brought another primitive species into the galactic fold. If only he'd known what he was really walking into. The landing at the human diplomatic facility should have been Krelnuth's moment of triumph. He had it all planned out in his slimy little head. Dramatic exit from the ship. Maybe let Vextar roar a bit for effect, watch the primitive humans wet themselves in terror, then graciously accept their surrender. It was going to be beautiful. What actually happened was considerably less dramatic and infinitely more confusing. The ship touched down at what the humans called the International Diplomatic Center, which sounded impressive enough, though Krelnuth noted with smug satisfaction that it was just a collection of boring concrete buildings. No towering spires, no intimidating architecture, nothing that screamed advanced civilization. These humans were even more primitive than the reports suggested. Krelnuth oozed out of the ship with all the dignity he could muster, which wasn't much given the whole leaving a trail of slime thing. Behind him, Vextar emerged like death incarnate, claws clicking against the metal ramp, acid literally dripping from its fangs. The apex predator let out what it considered an appropriately menacing growl, a sound that had made entire armies surrender without a fight. And then they met Ambassador Jake Morrison. Jake was standing there in what appeared to be a simple black suit, hands clasped behind his back, looking about as impressed as someone watching paint dry. He was maybe 6 feet tall, which made him look absolutely tiny next to Vextar, had graying hair that suggested he'd been doing this job for a while, and eyes that had clearly seen some things. When Vextar's roar echoed across the landing pad, Jake didn't even blink. Instead, he walked forward with a slight smile and said, "Welcome to Earth, gentlemen. I'm Ambassador Morrison. Hope the flight wasn't too rough. Can I offer anyone coffee? We've got a fresh pot brewing." Krelnuth was so taken aback he actually stopped moving, which meant he left an even bigger slime puddle than usual. This wasn't how first contact was supposed to go. Where was the fear? The trembling? The immediate offers of surrender? Vextar, meanwhile, was having its own moment of confusion. The apex predator had perfected its intimidation routine over decades of diplomatic missions. Step 1. emerge dramatically. Step 2. Make terrifying noise. Step 3. Watch targets flee in terror or immediately grovel for mercy. There was no step 4 because there had never needed to be a step 4. But this human was just standing there, still smiling, apparently waiting for an answer about coffee. Jake seemed to notice their confusion and continued cheerfully. I know the trip from the outer rim takes a while. Always leaves me feeling a bit dehydrated. And you, sir, he gestured toward Vexstar with the casual air of someone pointing out a mildly interesting cloud formation. That's some impressive dental work you've got there. Must be hell to floss though, right? Vexstar's jaw actually dropped a little. In its entire career as a professional nightmare, no one had ever complimented its teeth, or asked about its oral hygiene routine. Krelnoth finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a strangled gurgle. We are here on official business of the Galactic Council. I am Ambassador Krelnoth, and this is my security specialist, Vexstar of Mortis Prime. Pleasure to meet you both, Jake replied, extending his hand toward Krelnoth, who stared at it like it might explode. And Mortis Prime, wow, heard that's a tough neighborhood. Bet you've got some stories. Vexstar made a sound that might have been agreement, which was weird because it usually just made sounds that meant I'm going to eat your face. Jake seemed to take their continued bewilderment in stride. Tell you what, why don't we head inside? Conference rooms got air conditioning, and honestly it's a bit warm out here for formal negotiations. Plus I think our catering team put together something special. They're excited to meet their first non-terrestrial guests. He started walking toward the building like this was the most normal thing in the world, calling over his shoulder. Fair warning though, they might ask for selfies later. Hope that's okay. Our social media team is really pushing the whole historic first contact angle. Krelnoth slithered after him, mainly because he couldn't think of what else to do. This was all wrong. Humans were supposed to be primitive and easily intimidated. They weren't supposed to offer refreshments and worry about photo opportunities. Vexstar followed, but its usual predatory stalking had been replaced by something more like cautious curiosity. The apex predator was starting to wonder if maybe the intelligence reports had missed something important about these humans. As they walked through the facility's corridors, Jake kept up a steady stream of casual conversation, pointing out various features of the building and asking polite questions about their journey. He treated Vexstar's presence like having a 12-foot death machine following them around was perfectly normal Tuesday behavior. And that's when it started to dawn on Vexstar that maybe, just maybe, these humans might be more than they appeared to be. The conference room was disappointingly normal. Beige walls, a long wooden table, chairs that looked comfortable enough, and absolutely nothing that screamed advanced Deathworld civilization. Krelnoth was starting to feel a bit better about the whole situation. Maybe this Jake character was just an anomaly. Maybe the rest of the humans would be more appropriately terrified. Jake gestured for them to sit, though Vexstar remained standing because 12-foot apex predators don't really do human furniture. So Jake began, settling into his chair like he was catching up with old friends. I understand you're here about trade negotiations. Something about incorporating Earth into the galactic economy. That's correct, Krelnoth said, trying to regain some of his authority. The Galactic Council has determined that your species shows potential for limited integration, provided you accept certain conditions regarding resource allocation and technological restrictions. Jake nodded thoughtfully. And I'm guessing those conditions are pretty heavily weighted in the Council's favor. Well, naturally, more advanced civilizations require certain considerations. Right, Jake interrupted with a wave of his hand. The old protection racket approach. We've seen that before. Actually, that reminds me of something that might interest your friend here. He turned to Vexstar with genuine curiosity. You're from a death world, right? Mortis Prime. I bet your people had to get pretty creative to survive there. Vexstar made a low rumbling sound that might have been agreement. See, that's fascinating to me, Jake continued, because Earth's kind of a death world too, though I guess we don't advertise it much. Vexstar, you mind if I show you something? I think you might appreciate our approach to survival. Before anyone could object, Jake had pulled out a tablet and was swiping through what appeared to be video files. This is footage from something we call extreme sports. Basically, humans who got bored with regular survival decided to make it more challenging. The first video showed a human jumping out of an aircraft at 30,000 feet. Vexstar's head tilted slightly, which for an apex predator was equivalent to dropping your jaw in shock. That's skydiving, Jake explained casually. We jump out of perfectly good aircraft for fun. This particular guy is doing it without oxygen at high altitude, just to make it more interesting. The next video showed humans throwing themselves off cliffs with nothing but elastic cords attached to their ankles. Bungee jumping. The goal is to fall as far as possible without dying. It's surprisingly popular. Vexstar was now staring at the screen with what could only be described as horrified fascination. Jake kept scrolling. Oh, here's a good one. Free solo rock climbing. That's where humans climb sheer cliff faces hundreds of feet high without any safety equipment. One mistake and you're dead, but apparently that's what makes it exciting. Krelnoth was getting increasingly uncomfortable with this tangent. This is all very interesting, but we should return to the matter of trade negotiations. Actually, let me show you one more, Jake said, finding another video. This is from our Winter Olympics. Humans strap pieces of wood or metal to their feet and throw themselves down mountains at speeds that would kill most species. We call it skiing and snowboarding. Oh, and we made it competitive, so now humans try to do it faster and with more elaborate aerial maneuvers. Vexstar made a sound that no apex predator should ever make. It was almost like a whimper. The really crazy part, Jake continued, warming to his subject, is that none of this is for survival. We do this for entertainment. Our actual survival methods are way more intense. He pulled up what appeared to be historical footage. This is from our military history. Humans in something called trench warfare, where they spent years living in muddy holes while trying to kill each other with increasingly creative weapons. The life expectancy was measured in weeks, but they kept volunteering. More footage flashed by. Humans charging into machine gun fire. Humans deliberately crashing aircraft into enemy ships. Humans fighting in conditions that would kill most species within hours. We also keep predators as pets. Jake mentioned offhandedly. Wolves, big cats, sometimes sharks. We domesticated wolves into dogs, and now millions of humans share their homes with descendants of pack hunters. Some people keep snakes. Venomous ones, sometimes. Vexstar was now sitting down, which was not something it had done in a professional capacity for decades. Oh, and our sports, Jake added. We invented games where the entire point is for humans to try to give each other brain damage. American football, rugby, ice hockey, boxing, mixed martial arts. We televise these events and millions of people watch them for entertainment. The apex predator was staring at Jake with an expression that suggested its entire worldview was being systematically dismantled. The funny thing is, Jake said, setting down the tablet, most humans think we're pretty tame compared to our ancestors. The really crazy stuff happened before we developed modern safety regulations. Vexstar slowly turned to look at Krelnoth, who was trying very hard to pretend this conversation wasn't happening. And that's when it started to dawn on the apex predator that maybe, just maybe, the intelligence reports had gotten things completely backwards. These humans weren't helpless prey animals who needed artificial protection from their environment. They were predators who had made their environment afraid of them. For the next 20 minutes, Krelnoth tried desperately to salvage what was rapidly becoming the worst diplomatic mission of his career. He'd launched into his standard intimidation speech, the one that had worked flawlessly on dozens of primitive species. He talked about the Galactic Council's vast military might, their technological superiority, and the terrible consequences that befell worlds that refused to cooperate. Jake listened politely, occasionally nodding and making little, sounds like he was taking notes on a grocery list. At one point, he actually yawned. Are you even listening to me? Krelnoth finally snapped, leaving a particularly agitated slime trail as he writhed in frustration. Oh, absolutely, Jake replied. You're telling me that if we don't sign your trade agreement, the Council will send a fleet to subjugate our planet. Standard gunboat diplomacy. We've seen it before. Seen it before. Krelnoth's voice shot up an octave. This is your first contact with galactic civilization. Well, sure, with you guys, Jake agreed. But the concept isn't exactly new. We've been doing this to each other for thousands of years. Actually, we got pretty good at it. Vexstar had been silently observing this exchange while trying to process everything it had learned about human nature. The apex predator was experiencing something it had never felt before. Genuine uncertainty about whether it could actually win a fight. This was not a comfortable feeling for a creature that had built its entire identity around being the most dangerous thing in any given room. You want to know the funny thing about gunboat diplomacy? Jake continued conversationally. It only works if the other side is afraid of your gunboats. And humanity kind of has a history of not being particularly impressed by superior firepower. He pulled up another video on his tablet. This is from something we called World War II. See those ships? Those are Japanese aircraft carriers, at the time the most advanced naval vessels in the world. They'd just launched a surprise attack on our naval base at Pearl Harbor, sank most of our Pacific fleet. Krelnoth perked up. Finally, an example of humans being defeated by superior technology. Now watch what happened next, Jake said, advancing the footage. Those same humans, with their fleet in ruins, decided the appropriate response was to build bigger fleets and hunt down every single one of those carriers. It took them 3 years, but they sank them all. Every last one. The video showed massive naval battles, aircraft swarming like angry bees, ships exploding in spectacular fireballs. The really impressive part, Jake noted, is that they were simultaneously fighting a war on the other side of the planet, against the most militarized nation on Earth. Two-front global war. And humanity's response was basically hold my beer and watch this. Vexter made another one of those concerning whimpering sounds. Oh, but that's not even the best part. Jake continued with the enthusiasm of someone sharing his favorite hobby. The best part is how they ended that war. See, the humans had been working on this little science project. Figured out how to split atoms and release all that binding energy at once. He pulled up footage of atomic bomb tests. Mushroom clouds bloomed across the screen like flowers of destruction. They built 2 of these things, dropped them on cities, and when the enemy still wouldn't surrender, they told them, "We've got more where those came from." Which was a complete bluff, by the way. They'd used up their entire nuclear arsenal, but the enemy didn't know that. Krelnoff was now staring at the screen with the same horrified fascination that had gripped Vexter. Course, after they won that war, they decided having weapons that could end all life on the planet wasn't quite enough. So they built bigger ones. Hydrogen bombs that made those first nukes look like firecrackers. Then they built thousands of them and spent 50 years pointing them at each other just to see who would blink first. Jake paused the video and looked directly at Krelnoff. Nobody blinked. They just kept building bigger bombs until they had enough firepower to sterilize the planet dozens of times over. We call it the Cold War, and somehow humanity survived it without actually ending the world. Though not for lack of trying. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. So here's the thing about your trade agreement, Jake said, his tone still perfectly conversational. You're basically asking a species that invented mutually assured destruction as a form of entertainment to be afraid of your fleet. That's like asking a shark to be intimidated by a goldfish. Krelnoff's slime production had reached critical levels. The floor around him looked like a small pond. But wait, Jake continued, holding up a finger. I haven't even gotten to the really scary stuff yet. See, all of that was just humans fighting other humans. You want to know what happens when humans decide something is an existential threat to the species. He pulled up more footage, this time of what appeared to be scientific facilities. We eradicated diseases that had been killing us for millennia. Smallpox, polio, dozens of others. Just decided they needed to stop existing and made it happen. We've driven species to extinction by accident, and when we put our minds to it, we can do it on purpose. Vexter was now openly staring at Jake with something approaching awe. The point is, Jake said, setting down the tablet and looking directly at Krelnoff. Humanity has spent its entire evolutionary history fighting things that were bigger, stronger, faster, and better armed than we are. And we've gotten really good at winning those fights. That's when Krelnoff made his fatal mistake. Faced with the complete collapse of his intimidation strategy, he fell back on the one tool that had never failed him. Vexter, he commanded, his voice shaking with rage and fear, demonstrate to this primitive monkey why he should show proper respect to his betters. The apex predator slowly turned to look at its employer. Then it looked at Jake, who was sitting calmly in his chair with his hands folded, still wearing that slight smile. Go ahead, Jake said quietly. I'm curious to see what you've got. Vexter stared at this human who had just casually described his species' history of turning warfare into an art form, who spoke about weapons of mass destruction like they were sporting equipment, who belonged to a race that had domesticated wolves and made them into pets. And in that moment, Vexter had what could only be described as a moment of perfect clarity. These humans weren't prey. They were apex predators who had gotten so good at being apex predators that they'd actually gotten bored and started making up new challenges for themselves. Fighting Vexter wouldn't be a battle between predator and prey. It would be a battle between 2 apex predators, and only one of them had spent the last several thousand years perfecting the art of killing things that were bigger and scarier than they were. Vexter looked at Krelnoff one more time, then at Jake, then back at Krelnoff. And then the apex predator did something it had never done in its entire professional career. It walked over to Jake's side of the table, and sat down like the galaxy's most dangerous guard dog. The sound Krelnoff made wasn't quite a scream, and wasn't quite a death rattle, but it was definitely the sound of a career ending in real time. The silence that followed Vextar's defection was the kind of profound quiet that usually precedes either enlightenment or complete mental breakdown. In Krelnoth's case, it was definitely leaning toward the latter. What? The ambassador finally managed to gurgle, his voice climbing into frequencies that probably violated several noise ordinances. Are you doing? Vextar looked down at its former employer with what might charitably be called patience, though on a 12-foot apex predator it looked more like the expression a parent makes when their toddler asks why they can't eat dirt for dinner. I am reassessing my employment situation. Vextar replied in a voice like grinding stone. It was the first time the creature had spoken since arriving on Earth, and frankly, everyone was a little surprised it could talk at all. Reassessing your employment situation. Krelnoth's slime production had reached biblical proportions. The conference room was starting to look like someone had dumped a barrel of cosmic jello on the floor. You have a contract. A binding legal agreement with the Galactic Council. Had. Vextar corrected with the calm precision of someone who had clearly thought this through. Past tense. I am hereby terminating my employment effective immediately. Jake meanwhile was watching this exchange with the fascinated attention of someone discovering a new and particularly entertaining sport. You know, he interjected helpfully. Earth labor laws are pretty worker-friendly. We've got strong protections against hostile work environments and unreasonable employer demands. Unreasonable, Krelnoth shrieked, which caused him to spray slime in a radius that definitely violated personal space boundaries. I told it to intimidate you. That's literally its job description. See, that's where things get legally interesting, Jake replied, pulling out what appeared to be a legal document from seemingly nowhere. According to the Galactic Employment Standards Act of 2387, which I took the liberty of looking up while you were having your meltdown, no employee can be compelled to perform duties that would result in their probable death or dismemberment. Vextar's head swiveled toward Jake with something approaching admiration. And based on our conversation about human military history, Jake continued. I think we can all agree that asking Vextar to attack a human constitutes a pretty clear violation of workplace safety standards. This is insane, Krelnoth wailed. You're a primitive species. You should be cowering in terror, begging for mercy, offering tribute. Yeah, about that, Jake said, reaching under the table and producing what appeared to be a sandwich wrapped in paper. Vextar, you hungry? Our catering team wasn't sure what apex predators from Death Worlds eat, so they kind of went with a build-your-own approach. The sandwich was roughly the size of a small briefcase and appeared to contain enough meat to feed a small army. Vextar accepted it with what could only be described as wonder. Thank you, the apex predator rumbled, unwrapping the offering with claws that could disembowel a rhinoceros. This is unexpected. We figured anyone who's traveled this far from home probably worked up an appetite, Jake explained. Plus our intelligence reports suggested that most galactic species have pretty bland food. We thought you might appreciate something with a little more flavor. Vextar took a bite of the sandwich and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a growl of approval. This is remarkably well seasoned. What is this red substance? Hot sauce, Jake replied. Made from capsaicin peppers. Humans bred them specifically to be painful to eat, then decided we liked the pain and made it a regular part of our diet. You bred plants to cause yourselves suffering, and then consumed them voluntarily. Vextar asked, pausing mid-bite. Pretty much, yeah. We've got whole festivals dedicated to seeing who can eat the most painful peppers without passing out. It's surprisingly popular. Vextar stared at the sandwich with renewed respect. Your species continues to confound me. Wait. Krelnoth interrupted, apparently deciding that watching his former bodyguard bond with the enemy over spicy food was the final straw. You can't just quit. You have obligations. Responsibilities. The Galactic Council will hear about this. Oh, I'm sure they will, Jake agreed cheerfully. In fact, I've already sent them a preliminary report about our first contact experience. Mentioned how professional and courteous Vextar has been throughout the entire process. He produced another document, because apparently Jake Morrison was the kind of diplomat who came prepared for every possible contingency. I also took the liberty of filing a formal complaint about your negotiation tactics. Turns out the Galactic Diplomatic Corps has pretty strict guidelines about threatening member species during trade negotiations. Krelnoth's eyes, such as they were, bulged to approximately twice their normal size. Member species. You're not a member species. You're barely space capable. We're barely space capable, Jake corrected. Amazing what you can accomplish when you put your mind to it. We've had observer status with the Council for about 6 months now. Didn't anyone mention that in your briefing? The sound Krelnoth made suggested that nobody had mentioned that in his briefing. Here's the thing about humans, Jake continued, settling back in his chair like he was explaining something to a particularly slow child. We're really good at making friends with people who treat us with respect, and we're even better at making life difficult for people who don't. He gestured toward Vextar, who was now halfway through the sandwich and looking more relaxed than anyone had seen the apex predator in decades. "Vexstar here has been nothing but professional, polite, respectful, didn't try to eat anyone despite probably being capable of taking out half our security team. That's the kind of behavior we appreciate. You on the other hand," Jake said, his tone remaining conversational, but somehow acquiring an edge that made the temperature in the room seem to drop by several degrees. "Walked into our house, demanded we sign over our economic sovereignty, and when we politely declined, you ordered your employee to attack us." Krelnoth was now producing so much slime that the custodial staff was probably going to need hazmat equipment. "So here's what's going to happen," Jake continued. "You're going to take your little trade agreement, and you're going to leave our planet. And when you report back to the Galactic Council, you're going to tell them that Earth is very interested in establishing diplomatic relations, but we prefer to deal with people who understand that intimidation is not a substitute for actual negotiation skills. And if I refuse," Krelnoth managed to croak. Jake's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes did. It was the same look that had probably appeared in human eyes right before they decided to split the atom, or right before they figured out how to turn wolves into dogs. "Well," Jake said quietly, "that would be unfortunate. See, we've been looking for an opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to galactic peace and security. And nothing says Earth is serious about diplomacies like publicly prosecuting someone for violating interstellar law during first contact." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm sure the galactic media would be very interested in the story of how the Council's top negotiator tried to use military force against a peaceful member species during a diplomatic mission." Krelnoth deflated like a punctured balloon, which, given the amount of slime involved, was a deeply unpleasant sight. "This isn't over," he wheezed, though it came out sounding more like a defeated sigh than a threat. "Oh, I think it is," Jake replied pleasantly. "But hey, look on the bright side, you'll always have the distinction of being the first alien to visit Earth. That's got to count for something on your resume." He turned to Vexstar, who had finished the sandwich and was now looking at Jake with something approaching gratitude. "Speaking of resumes," Jake said, "I don't suppose you'd be interested in discussing alternative employment opportunities. We're always looking for experienced security consultants, and frankly, your qualifications are impressive." Vexstar tilted its massive head thoughtfully. "What would such a position entail?" "Well, we've got a few more diplomatic missions coming up," Jake explained. "Turns out when word gets around that you've made contact with humans, everyone wants to meet you. Most of them are probably going to be a lot more reasonable than your former boss here, but it never hurts to have good security. And the compensation," Jake pulled out yet another document. The man was like a filing cabinet with legs. "Standard Earth diplomatic security salary, full benefits package, paid vacation, medical coverage, and a retirement plan. Plus, we've got this thing called workers' compensation that covers job-related injuries. You provide medical care for employees injured in the course of their duties." Vexstar asked, sounding genuinely surprised. "Of course, what kind of employer doesn't take care of their people?" Vexstar glanced meaningfully at Krelnoth, who was now sitting in a puddle of his own despair. "Your terms are acceptable," the apex predator announced. "I accept your offer of employment." And that's how the galaxy's most feared bodyguard became Earth's newest diplomatic asset, while Krelnoth learned the hard way that sometimes the primitive species turn out to be a lot more sophisticated than advertised. 6 months later, the galaxy had developed what could charitably be called trust issues regarding humanity. It started small, as these things usually do. Word spread through the usual diplomatic channels that Ambassador Krelnoth had returned from his mission to Earth, in what witnesses described as a state of complete psychological collapse. The official report filed with the Galactic Council was 3 pages of increasingly incoherent rambling about humans being unreasonably dangerous and disturbingly polite about their capacity for violence. The Council, being bureaucrats, initially dismissed this as the ravings of someone who'd had a bad first contact experience. After all, Krelnoth had always been a bit dramatic, and everyone knew that primitive species could be unpredictable. They filed the report under Diplomatic Incidents Minor and moved on with their lives. Then the follow-up reports started arriving. The first came from a trade delegation that had approached Earth expecting to find a naive species eager to trade raw materials for basic technology. Instead, they discovered that humans had somehow reverse-engineered galactic standard technology from the debris of a single probe that had crashed on their planet decades earlier. Not only had they figured out how it worked, they'd improved it. The human modifications were more efficient, more durable, and came with something called a warranty that apparently guaranteed they would work properly or the humans would fix them for free. The trade delegation returned with a mutually beneficial agreement, and a lingering sense that they'd been outmaneuvered by people who had been playing this game for considerably less time than should have been mathematically possible. The second report came from a scientific expedition that had offered to share basic medical technology with the humans as a gesture of galactic goodwill. The humans politely thanked them, then proceeded to demonstrate their own medical advances, which included something called surgery, where they would deliberately cut people open to fix internal problems, chemotherapy, where they poisoned patients just enough to kill diseases without killing the patient, and vaccines, where they deliberately infected people with weakened versions of deadly diseases to prevent them from getting the full-strength versions later. The expedition leader's report included the phrase, "They perform controlled violence on themselves as a form of healthcare," and a recommendation that the Council's xenobiology department might want to revise some of their assumptions about baseline survival instincts. But it was the third report that really got the Council's attention. A routine patrol had detected an unauthorized ship in human space and moved to investigate, expecting to find smugglers or pirates. Instead, they found a human research vessel that was apparently conducting what they called asteroid mining. The humans had built machines that could tear apart entire asteroids and process the raw materials into useful products. In space, while traveling between star systems, when the patrol captain asked how long they'd been doing this, the human research team leader had shrugged and said, "Oh, about 3 weeks. We're still working out the kinks in the system." 3 weeks. They'd gone from basic space travel to industrial-scale asteroid processing in 3 weeks. The patrol captain's report was a single sentence: recommend immediate diplomatic contact before they figure out something that makes us nervous. Which brings us to the current situation, where Ambassador Jake Morrison was sitting in a conference room aboard the Galactic Council's primary diplomatic station, accompanied by his security chief, Vexter, who was wearing a custom-made badge that read Earth's Goodest Boy. The badge had been Jake's idea, and Vexter wore it with what could only be described as pride. The apex predator had discovered that working for humans came with perks that had never occurred to it during its previous career. Regular meals, for instance. Actual conversations with colleagues who treated it like a person rather than a weapon. And something called job satisfaction, which apparently happened when your employers actually appreciated your work instead of just expecting you to be terrifying on command. The current meeting was with a delegation from the Centauri Trade Consortium, who had specifically requested human participation in negotiations regarding mining rights in the Outer Rim territories. Not because they needed human approval, but because they'd heard about the asteroid processing technology and wanted to discuss licensing agreements. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Jake was saying, reviewing the contract they'd presented. "You want to license our asteroid mining technology, but you also want exclusive rights to all mineral extraction in sectors 7 through 12, plus a 30% tariff on any goods we produce, using our own technology in those sectors." The lead Centauri negotiator, a crystalline being named Zarthox, made what might have been a confident gesture. "Those are standard terms for technology licensing agreements with developing species." "Uh-huh," Jake replied, making notes on his tablet. "And what exactly do we get out of this arrangement?" "Access to galactic markets, of course, and the protection of the consortium's security forces." Jake glanced at Vexter, who was sitting quietly beside him and radiating the kind of calm menace that suggested protection might not be humanity's primary concern. "That's very generous," Jake said diplomatically. "But I think there might be some misunderstanding about our current position. See, we've already got access to galactic markets through our trade agreements with the Altarian Republic and the Vegan Free States. And as for security," he gestured toward Vexter, "I think we're pretty well covered." Zarthox's crystalline structure shifted in what was probably surprise. "You have existing trade agreements, but you've only been spacefaring for about 8 months now," Jake confirmed. "Amazing what you can accomplish when you put your mind to it." "Actually, that reminds me, Vexter, did the shipyard reports come in this morning?" "Yes, Ambassador," Vexter replied in its gravelly voice. "Construction is proceeding ahead of schedule. The first batch of human-designed vessels should be ready for delivery next month." "Human-designed vessels?" Zarthox asked, its voice climbing in pitch. "Oh, just some modifications to standard galactic ship designs," Jake explained casually. "Better engine efficiency, improved life support systems, more robust construction. We figured if we were going to be traveling between stars regularly, we might as well do it in ships that won't fall apart if someone looks at them wrong." What Jake didn't mention was that human engineers had taken one look at galactic standard spacecraft and had what could only be described as a collective aneurysm. Apparently, the rest of the galaxy had been building ships like they were afraid of space, with multiple redundant safety systems and designs that prioritized avoiding danger over actually accomplishing anything useful. Human ships, by contrast, were built like everything else humans made, with the assumption that dangerous situations were inevitable, and the best approach was to build something tough enough to handle whatever the universe could throw at it. The first human starship design included features like armored hulls, redundant power systems, and what the engineering team cheerfully called aggressive damage control protocols. When galactic shipbuilders saw the plans, their reaction had been somewhere between admiration and horror. The ships were undeniably superior to anything else in space, but they were also clearly designed by people who expected to get into fights and wanted to make sure they won. We've also been making some improvements to standard galactic technology, Jake continued, pulling up a presentation on his tablet. More efficient power generation, better materials science, improved communication systems. Nothing too fancy, just applying some basic human engineering principles. The presentation showed a series of comparison charts that made Zarthox's crystalline structure dim noticeably. Human improvements weren't just marginal gains, they were order of magnitude improvements that made existing galactic technology look like it had been designed by committee. How is this possible? Zarthox finally asked. Your species has been spacefaring for less than a year. Well, Jake said thoughtfully, I think it comes down to different approaches to problem solving. Most galactic species seem to focus on avoiding problems. Humans tend to focus on solving them. He pulled up another chart. Take space travel, for example. Galactic standard practice is to plot careful routes that avoid dangerous regions, maintain constant communication with traffic control, and carry enough supplies for 3 times the expected journey duration. Those are sensible safety precautions, Zarthox protested. Oh, absolutely, Jake agreed. But humans looked at the same problem and thought, what if we just built ships that could handle the dangerous regions? Turns out, if you're not worried about avoiding asteroid fields and radiation storms, you can take much more direct routes. Cuts travel time by about 60% on average. Vexter made a rumbling sound that might have been amusement. The ambassador is being modest. Human ships do not merely handle dangerous regions. They navigate them as if they were recreational activities. That's because they kind of are, Jake admitted. Our pilots have been comparing space navigation to something called storm chasing, which is apparently a hobby where humans deliberately fly aircraft into severe weather patterns to see what happens. Zarthox was now actively flickering, which was probably the crystalline equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Look, Jake said, setting down his tablet and leaning forward with the kind of smile that suggested he was about to make an offer that couldn't be refused. Here's what I'm thinking. Instead of licensing our technology to you, why don't we discuss a partnership? We provide the improved tech, you provide access to your existing trade networks, and we split the profits 50-50. Zarthox managed to croak. Well, 60-40 in your favor if you can guarantee exclusive access to the Outer Rim mining territories. Jake added generously. We're not greedy. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense negotiations Zarthox had ever experienced. Jake Morrison, it turned out, negotiated like humans did everything else, with a combination of cheerful ruthlessness and casual competence that left his opponents feeling like they'd been caught in a particularly friendly landslide. By the end of the meeting, the Centauri Trade Consortium had agreed to a partnership that gave humans significant mining rights, access to galactic trade networks, and a 60-40 split of all profits in humanity's favor. In exchange, humans would provide improved technology and what Jake called logistical support. Pleasure doing business with you, Jake said, shaking Zarthox's hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested this was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, whether Zarthox liked it or not. After the Centauri delegation left, Vextar turned to Jake with what might have been curiosity. Ambassador, may I ask a question? Of course. What's on your mind? When you said logistical support, what exactly did you mean? Jake's smile took on a slightly predatory edge. Oh, just that we'll make sure the trade routes stay safe and profitable. You know how dangerous space can be. Pirates, raiders, hostile governments trying to interfere with legitimate commerce. And humans are prepared to discourage such interference. Vextar, Jake said, pulling up a file on his tablet. Let me show you something called the United States Navy. Specifically, their historical approach to protecting maritime trade routes. As Jake began explaining concepts like gunboat diplomacy, freedom of navigation operations, and showing the flag, Vextar began to understand why the galaxy was developing trust issues regarding humanity. Humans hadn't just joined galactic civilization. They joined it, with the clear intention of reorganizing it, according to human standards of efficiency, safety, and what they called enlightened self-interest. The galaxy was about to discover that humans didn't just make good allies. They made terrifying enemies, and even more terrifying friends. And somewhere in a minor trade station in the Outer Rim, Krelnuth was filing reports about shipping manifests, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that his entire career had been ended by a species that considered jumping out of aircraft a recreational activity. The universe, Vexstar reflected, had a sense of irony that would have impressed even the predators of Mortis Prime. And humans, apparently, had a sense of humor that made the universe's irony look subtle by comparison.